It all started with a pledge that no parent should ever have to second-guess. Emma Clark and K.H. Lowe Hayes, two 19-year-old friends, ventured into the wild backcountry of Colorado, assuring their worried families that they would remain safe. They were well equipped with all the necessary gear, food, and even a satellite tracker for their journey. But just a few days in, all communication abruptly ceased. Search teams meticulously combed the mountain terrain, only to find a peculiar and disturbing scene. A campsite left behind, completely undisturbed, as if the girls had simply vanished without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no ripped tents or scattered supplies, only a profound and inexplicable emptiness. For 5 agonizing years, the puzzle of their disappearance deepened, until a hunter stumbled upon a discovery no one could have anticipated: a single, weathered bone pierced by a rusted arrowhead. With this finding, the truth behind what befell Emma and K.H. Lowe shifted from a natural mystery to something far more sinister, deliberate, and terrifying. The sun had just begun to cut through the morning mist when Kate Blackwell checked the tracking app on her phone. This had become her routine over the 3 days her daughter, Emma, and her best friend, K.H. Lowe, were scheduled to be backpacking in Colorado's rugged wilderness. The small satellite device the girls carried was meant to be a source of comfort, a bright point of light offering reassurance that technology could span the vast gap between civilization and the untamed wild. That morning, however, the map felt wrong. The blinking dot representing her daughter's location was frozen. It remained motionless on the screen, stuck at a remote campsite deep within the San Juan National Forest. As the hours ticked by, the device failed to update. There was no new trail of digital footprints appearing on the map and no comforting ping to signal they were on the move. There was only silence. For a mother, that kind of silence is a form of screaming. Kate attempted to find a logical explanation. Perhaps the batteries had run out or the girls had lost the signal while in a canyon. Maybe they had switched it off to save power. But as each hour passed, these comforting theories began to fall apart. The dots signified their last known position. Beyond that point, there was nothing but an empty void. It was the first indication that something had gone terribly, irrevocably awry. By that afternoon, search parties had battled their way to the coordinates from the tracker. What they discovered there only intensified the growing feeling of dread. The tent was expertly pitched, its nylon fabric pulled tight against the ground stakes. Their backpacks were propped neatly against a pine tree. A small fire pit, partially enclosed by smooth stones, contained the blackened embers from the previous night's fire. Nothing was overturned or in disarray. To the casual observer, it appeared to be an ordinary campsite, simply awaiting the return of its occupants from a brief walk. But the occupants never came back. Emma's jacket was still neatly folded inside her sleeping bag. K.H. Lowe's hiking boots were placed at the entrance of the tent, their laces carefully tucked inside as if ready for the next morning. Their food supply was properly stored in bear-proof containers, completely untouched. Even the girls' water bottles were full. It was as though they had just stepped out for a moment and disappeared into the woods, leaving their lives perfectly organized behind them. Experienced searchers looked at one another with unease. A messy campsite suggests panic, a fight, or perhaps wild animals foraging for food. But a pristine camp that its owners never returned to, that suggests something else entirely. The campsite became an unnerving puzzle etched into the forest floor, with every detail whispering a story of deep unease. For Kate, the news of the campsite was simultaneously a source of relief and a living nightmare. She was relieved to know the girls had at least made it to that point and hadn't been lost on the way or caught in an unexpected storm. However, the impeccable neatness of the camp was a torment. The girls were skilled hikers, known for being cautious and organized. If they had decided to leave on their own, they would have taken their equipment with them. If they had been taken by force, there would surely be evidence of a struggle. Instead, there was just a vacuum, a flawless absence where answers should have been. The questions began to multiply like shadows lengthening at sunset. Why would they leave their shoes? Why would they abandon their food and water? Why didn't they use the satellite device to send a distress signal? The quiet of the forest offered no answers. It only seemed to mock the frantic desperation of those searching for the girls. To truly grasp the gravity of their disappearance, you have to understand who Emma and K.H. Lowe were. Emma Clark, at 19, was incredibly smart and possessed a stubborn streak common in children raised by single mothers. She had a passion for books, classic folk music, and an independent spirit that both frustrated and filled her mother with immense pride. She was not a reckless person. She was responsible, the type of young woman who would create detailed checklists before embarking on a weekend getaway. K.H. Lowe Hayes was her perfect counterpart. While Emma was introspective and serious, K.H. Lowe was a burst of energy, always ready with a laugh or a challenge, and sometimes a bit more daring than was prudent. They had been inseparable since their middle school days, forming a friendship that felt unbreakable. Their hiking trip had been meticulously planned, meant to be one last great summer adventure before college took them on separate journeys. Both were strong, healthy, and skilled enough to manage a 3-day trek through the wilderness. Neither of them matched the profile of someone who would vanish without a single clue. This very contradiction made the mystery all the more acute. If Emma and K.H. Lowe were the ones facing the dangers of the wilderness, it was Kate who was left most exposed by their absence. A mother's universe is not built to continue turning without her child at its center. Her Denver apartment suddenly felt vast and empty, with every room echoing the void Emma left behind. The scent of her daughter's shampoo still lingered in the bathroom, and her books remained in haphazard stacks on her bedside table. Kate found herself constantly staring at Emma's bedroom door, hoping it might swing open to reveal her daughter, her cheeks rosy from the crisp mountain air. But night after night, Kate slept with her phone on the pillow next to her, waiting for a call or message that never arrived. And every morning she awoke with the same heavy question pressing down on her heart. Where is my daughter? The Colorado backcountry is as stunningly beautiful as it is unforgiving. Towering mountains stand guard over valleys sculpted by ancient glaciers, forests form dense, seemingly endless walls of green, and powerful storms can materialize with almost no warning. For those who respect its power, it is a paradise. For those who make a mistake, it can be lethal. Emma and K.H. Lowe were two young women facing this immense landscape. Their strength, though significant, was delicate when measured against the sheer indifference of nature. A misstep on loose rock, a sudden, sharp drop in temperature, or an encounter with a curious predator. Any of these scenarios was more plausible than the perfect, empty state of their campsite. And so, the search commenced, a quest not just for bodies or clues, but for a reason. What kind of force, whether human, natural, or something unspoken, could so cleanly wipe away 2 lives, leaving nothing behind but questions? Kate sat through the official press briefings, withstood the swarm of reporters, and listened to desperate theories, but in her private moments, she clung to a quieter, fiercer hope. She replayed her final conversation with Emma, hearing her daughter's laughter and her promise to be safe, her promise that she would return. Those words became her prayer, her torment, and her solemn vow. Every night, Kate would go back to that frozen dot on her phone's screen, the last digital breadcrumb left in the vast forest. She would stare at it until exhaustion finally claimed her. For 5 years, that single point on the map would remain the epicenter of her world, a cruel, unmoving reminder of where everything came to a halt and where all searching had to begin. The first 2 days were a whirlwind of desperate activity. By the sunrise of the second day, the thumping sound of helicopter rotors echoed throughout the mountains. The loud, mechanical noise shattered the peaceful quiet of the high altitudes, bringing with it the hope that the 2 missing hikers below might be seen waving desperately from a clearing in the thick trees. Coordinators for the search and rescue effort guided the pilots along mountain ridges, through valleys, and over sharp cliffs, creating a map of the areas where Emma Clark and K.H. Lowe Hayes could have wandered off. On the ground, their families and other volunteers looked up at the sky, observing the helicopters as they moved across the horizon like robotic birds of prey. Every time a helicopter passed, it felt like a connection to the lost girls. This sight provided the parents, neighbors, and classmates with a delicate hope that modern tools could triumph over the immense wilderness. The helicopters were equipped with infrared cameras that could find body heat, even during the cold nights in the forest. They also had powerful speakers that broadcasted the girls' names into the valleys. However, with each unsuccessful search, the feeling of hope faded a little bit more. Teams with search dogs moved slowly through the dense bushes, their noses close to the ground as their handlers shouted words of encouragement. The dogs would bark at the tracks of deer, dig at the entrances to rabbit burrows, and go around in circles on scent trails that were disappearing into nothing. It was as if the two teenagers had been erased from the world, leaving no evidence, no smell, and no footprints to help the search teams. For Kate Blackwell, who was Emma's mother, watching the search dogs move through the forest was almost too much to bear. She had been sure that her daughter's scent was so unique and recognizable that it couldn't just disappear. But after many hours of searching, every team came back, shaking their heads and saying the same thing that made a terrible fear grow inside her. No sign. The wilderness was not just enormous, it was also cruelly silent. With each day that went by without any news, the unspoken fear grew stronger. Maybe the forest wasn't just hiding the girls, perhaps it had consumed them completely. Desperate situations often lead to wishful thinking, and before long, the community started to hold on to every piece of gossip and rumor. 3 days after the search had started, a story came from a small convenience store located 30 miles south of where the trail began. An employee there was sure he had seen 2 young women who fit the girls' descriptions. He said they were buying sports drinks and snack bars late in the evening. He was positive that one of them had a backpack with a patch that looked like the flag of Colorado. This information brought a sudden burst of energy to the search. Detectives rushed to the store to examine the security camera videos. Families gathered at the sheriff's department, anxiously waiting for news. For a few stressful hours, hope began to grow once more. However, the video from the camera showed something different. The blurry footage did not show Emma and K.H. Lowe, but instead 2 out-of-state college students who were tired from a long drive. The patch on the backpack was not the Colorado flag, but a worn-out symbol from a ski resort. The hope disappeared as quickly and painfully as it had appeared. Journalists, who had started writing headlines about a miraculous discovery, quietly erased their work. The store clerk's confidence faded away under the harsh lights of the police station, and he ended up giving a shame-faced apology. False alarms started to become a recurring issue. A farmer was certain he had heard the voices of young women crying for help near his land. Police officers searched the area but only found coyotes. Another hiker reported finding a piece of purple cloth caught on a tree branch. When it was examined, it turned out to be an old, weather-beaten bandana that had been thrown away years ago. Each one of these dead ends chipped away at the community's morale, leaving the families feeling emotionally drained and exhausted. The most painful aspect of every false report was the emotional roller coaster it created. It would start with a feeling of hope, which would then turn into an even deeper sense of hopelessness. Each time this happened, it made the questions that were bothering everyone even more intense. If the girls were not lost in the forest, then where could they be? And who or what had taken them away? After 3 exhausting weeks, the search operation had reached its limit. Resources were becoming scarce, volunteers were tired, and state authorities had to start comparing the costs of the search with the chances of finding the girls alive. The helicopters were sent back to their hangars. News crews packed up their equipment and left, their interest gone because there were no new updates. The wilderness, which had been filled with the noise of engines, barking dogs, and people's voices, returned to its natural, quiet state. For the families, the news that the search was being reduced felt like a form of betrayal that was being presented as a standard procedure. To them, it seemed like the authorities were giving up. Kate made an emotional appeal at a press conference, her voice trembling while the cameras were recording. How can you reduce a mother's love? How can you give up searching when your child is still missing? But the officials had numbers to present, budgets to manage, and statistics that showed a very bleak outlook. After 21 days, the probability of survival in those conditions was extremely low, less than 1%. The decision was framed not as giving up, but as changing to a strategy of occasional check-ins and ongoing investigation. In practical terms, it meant the searchlights were turned off, the dogs were put back in their kennels, and the helicopters were no longer flying. The families felt abandoned in the silence that followed. The trails that had been full of searchers were now empty. Posters showing the smiling faces of Emma and K.H. Lowe began to curl up at the corners, worn down by the weather as they flapped against telephone poles. The command center, once a hub of activity, was now just a locked trailer with all its maps and plans taken down. What was left behind was an emptiness, an absence of answers, of closure, and of the two daughters. And within that emptiness, a darker feeling began to emerge. Quiet conversations about foul play, rumors of an abduction, and theories about hidden crimes started to circulate among neighbors and on internet forums. When the official search ended, unofficial theories quickly took its place to fill the silence. This was the first strange development that changed the disappearance from a sad accident into a puzzling mystery. The collective, understanding that the girls had not been found in the forest, and possibly never would be, became clear. What had started as a simple search and rescue mission turned into something much more unsettling. The unanswered question of why. Why the trail was so clean, why their campsite was undisturbed, and why their satellite communication device had stopped working, started to feel more significant than the girls' absence itself. The reduction of the search was not the final chapter of the story. It was the moment that set everything else in motion. The families, who had previously depended on official help, would now begin to follow rumors, face theories that were more terrifying than they could have imagined, and encounter truths that would destroy the very foundation of their lives. After 5 years, a tragic event has had enough time to change into a local legend. By the time the second winter arrived, the missing girls had become a proper noun, referred to as the missing. Stories told around campfires began to weave themselves around the details of the clean, untouched campsite, like a vine slowly covering a wall. Guides working in the foothills would tell new employees not to set up their tents near the old logging path where the satellite device had stopped working. Teenagers would dare each other to say the names Emma and K.H. Lowe into the forest wind, as if they could persuade the woods to give them a response. A waitress working at the Trailhead Diner began to keep a jar of paper cranes on the counter. Whenever a customer asked about their purpose, she would reply that they were for protection, and then slide the jar nearer to the cash register. The story gradually accumulated details, much like a river gathers silt. These details included the pot on the cold stove that was never used for boiling, the zip tent with the sleeping bag still lying perfectly flat, and the half-finished packing list, where a check mark was paused between iodine tabs and extra socks. There were no signs of a bear, no marks indicating something had been dragged, and no footprints left after the first rain had washed the ground. Hikers carried this legend back to their homes, adjusting and adding parts, until even the people who lived there began to question whether they remembered the original facts or the version that was retold. The rumors that spread were as specific as accusations, but as unclear as fog. A local rancher claimed he had seen 2 figures on the service road at dawn, walking away from the start of the trail. A retired woman was certain she had heard laughter coming from the trees at 3 in the morning. A person geocaching found a charm bracelet caught on a juniper tree and shared a picture of it on an online forum. The discussion that followed was full of people convinced it was a clue, until Kate confirmed the bracelet did not belong to Emma. For every rumor that sparked a little bit of hope, 3 other stories would emerge to extinguish it, mentioning things like mountain men, cults, or a mine shaft that was not marked on any map. The local sheriff's department would respond with either brief, stern replies or apologies. Their official statement became no evidence of foul play, but it was a puzzling thing to say. What other term could describe two girls disappearing from a campsite that was left in perfect condition? A new deputy who had just started working in the county secretly told a reporter that the neatness of the site disturbed him more than any crime scene he had ever visited. He said, "It looked staged," and that word, staged, kept echoing. At the outfitter shop, the owner started to keep a box labeled tips under his counter. Inside, people left hand-drawn maps of old hunting trails, names written on napkins, and blurry pictures of strange lights among the aspen trees. People either wanted to feel helpful, be close to the excitement of the story, or both. The box filled up quickly but then was left untouched. During the fourth autumn, the owner cleared it out with the same look he had during a fire ban in a dry season. There was nothing left to pursue, but the story's influence remained. The ghost story seemed to contaminate the entire landscape. Even on clear, sunny days, when the mountain ridges looked as sharp as broken glass, the remote wilderness felt like a room that everyone had just suddenly left. People would lower their voices when they stood at the scenic overlook. At the end of a day hike, parents would count their children twice. Campers who used to travel with minimal gear now attached emergency beacons to their chests, like they were wearing a second heart. Kate Blackwell, however, rejected the folklore. As the county's efforts decreased, hers increased. She learned all about the shapes of drone batteries and how much fuel a helicopter burns at high altitudes. She raised funds first through bake sales and later through professionally organized events, putting up with the spotlight she disliked because people's generosity depended on it. She hired, let go, and then rehired private search teams as the seasons turned. She divided the area into quadrants, printed out grid maps, and taped them all over her living room walls until the room itself looked like a topographical map, with mountains of paper, valleys of string, and red pins scattered like chokecherries. Small problems started to appear, like pebbles in a backpack. They were never heavy enough to make her stop, but they were constant enough to cause pain. A landowner on the western edge of the search area denied her team access to his property. He said it was a matter of principle because the previous search team had left tire tracks near his pond. A volunteer operating a drone posted a video clip on TikTok without getting permission, using Kate's grief as background music to get more views. A true crime podcaster showed up at her door with his microphone already recording. When Kate shut the door on him, he released the episode anyway, turning her refusal to speak into sensational clickbait. Suspicion started to creep into her daily tasks. When a clerk at the feed store paused before accepting her flyer, Kate interpreted his hesitation as a form of judgment, as if he were thinking, "Aren't you tired of this by now?" But she was not. She found the private investigator who had previously tracked cartel smuggling paths through the desert and made him communicate with her using maps. She met with a metallurgist in a lab at the community college to ask how long an arrow shaft could last in a snowpack. She pushed a retired park ranger to share stories of unmarked mine shafts, unofficial trails, and the shortcuts that poachers used. At night, the satellite messenger sat on her kitchen table, feeling like a constant accusation. She got to know every one of its indicator lights as if they were a loved one's freckles. She sent the device for diagnostic testing twice, and both times it came back with the same result. No malfunction had been recorded. Despite this, she called the manufacturer and asked about rare situations, signal interference, software glitches, and solar storms. An engineer gently told her, "It should have transmitted," a sentence she had been repeating to herself for 5 years. The internet was a source of both hope and disappointment. A woman in Wyoming was certain she had seen two girls who looked like they were from Colorado in a diner, so Kate drove for 6 hours just to watch another person's daughters eat waffles. A hiker posted the coordinates of a torn gray fleece he had found. When Kate finally got to the location, she discovered it was a jacket for a lost dog with a note inside that read, If you find me, call. The phone number was no longer in service. The constant pain of almost finding something became its own kind of emotional climate. Her marriage did not last through the second winter. The grief counselor had told them that some couples separate as a form of emotional survival, feeling that they need to shed weight to stay afloat. Kate got used to being alone in the silence. She figured out which of her friends could simply sit with her without mentally storing the moment to use in a future story, and which ones needed her sadness to be like a movie, with a clear plot, an emotional release, and a definite conclusion. She cut people out of her life without hesitation, and then felt guilty for the sense of relief that came afterward. One time, in late September, she had an argument with a guide who put up with her search team, but was annoyed by how their search was affecting the routes he could offer to his clients. "People come here for the wilderness," he said, looking at her maps. "You're turning a mystery into a grid." Kate wanted to tell him that the wilderness had already let her down and that it was not her responsibility to protect its image. Instead, she just asked him to sign a waiver to allow them access. He signed it, his eyes fixed on the pen. In the spring of the 5th year, the private team introduced a new piece of equipment, thermal drones that could detect the faint heat left on sun-warmed rocks after sunset. They scanned the ravines like hands smoothing out bedsheets. On the second night, the narrow, warm body of a coyote appeared on the screen and then disappeared. On the third night, they saw a group of elk. The searchers became quieter as the drone batteries ran out. Out in the forest, there were 1,000 moving things that could be answers, but none of them were the girls. Time did not heal, it hardened. Anniversaries turned into established rituals, involving a small gathering at the trailhead with coffee and biodegradable lanterns. Kate would prepare a speech on index cards but rarely used it. A new flyer would be distributed with a slightly updated age progression photo, which always seemed like someone else's guess of what Emma would look like. Each year, the county would approve the search permit with fewer restrictions, as if the search itself had become a respectable, scheduled event, listed on the town calendar between the 10K race and the chili cook-off. A different kind of anger began to build up in the cracks of her life. It would ignite over small things. When a tourist asked if the missing girls were the ones with the cute tent, Kate had to leave the store to breathe against the cool brick wall outside. When a local columnist wrote a heartfelt article about their community's resilience, she clenched her jaw, annoyed at how resilience seemed to depend on the wound staying open. Living without any resolution changed her senses. She could detect a lie as if someone had lightly tapped on a glass. She could distinguish between the sound of rain just beginning and rain that was about to end. She started carrying cash because she disliked seeing her grief itemized on her bank statements. Coffee, gas, copies, paper, batteries. Making lists became a kind of prayer for her, as did sharpening pencils. The county went through several sheriffs, and each new one brought the same promise: "We'll take a fresh look." This was followed by the same file boxes being dropped onto the same conference table. A new analyst would notice a detail in the campsite photos that a previous analyst had already pointed out: the way the trekking poles were propped up, or how the laces on one of the boots were looped but not tied. "Staged," the deputy had said in the first year. 5 years later, that word still felt like an accusation without anyone to accuse. In July, a lightning storm struck the ridge where the girls' hiking route would have taken them. The fire that resulted was small, quick, and easily put out, but Kate felt it as a personal loss. It was one more location turned to ash, one more layer of memory burned away. After the fire, the search team walked through the blackened hillside, sifting through charcoal with gloved hands, as if the fire might have reduced the complexity of the situation to a single, simple answer. Small acts of kindness would appear and then fade away. The mother of another missing hiker sent Kate a silver coin that had a tiny cross etched near its edge. The note with it said, "For the pocket, not the neck." A retiring ranger gave Kate a photocopy of a hand-drawn map he had created in 1978, which included landmarks with names that were no longer on official maps, like Widow's Table, Milk Glass Gully, and Needle Bone. The map showed a land contour that Kate had previously missed, a small channel where snow stayed late into the season, giving her another place to search when the spring thaw began. The ghost story continued to expand, but Kate's own version of the events rejected any supernatural explanations. She focused on ordinary possibilities: human error, human cruelty, and human habits. She would watch the start of the archery season appear on the calendar each year and feel a quiet, illogical sense of fear. It was not a theory she would ever voice. It was more like a shadow cast by a word that someone had once whispered and then taken back. Broadhead, fixed blade, old shafts left to rust. From a distance, continuous effort can look like standing still, but from the inside, Kate could feel the pressure mounting. She had new technology, old maps, and the narrowing of possibilities that occurs after you have searched nearly everywhere for nearly everything. Step by step, the story was getting tighter, not leading toward a clear explanation, but toward something that felt unavoidable. Something had to give way. In the valley, where legends grew as freely as wild brush, she would not mistake the silence for peace. The mountain held onto its secrets. The mother continued to ask the only question that truly mattered: where? And that question itself had become a sharp tool, a point she pressed, season after season, against the same unmoving stone. On that particular morning, the forest was unusually quiet, with a kind of deep silence that felt heavy on a person's chest. Brandon Mills had been hunting on these ridges since he was a young boy, but something about this day made him feel uneasy. The air seemed thicker than normal, feeling both damp and metallic. His dog, Duke, couldn't stop moving around nervously. The hound's ears kept twitching, and he let out a low, steady whine, as if the forest itself was whispering about something hidden beneath the ground. Duke was familiar with the scent of elk, bear, and even mountain lions, but this was something entirely new. He walked in circles, pushing his nose firmly into the dirt, only to back away with a quiet yelp. Brandon frowned, knowing that a hunter depends on his dog's intuition just as a sailor depends on the stars. When Duke refused to go any further, with his tail tucked between his legs, Brandon understood they were approaching something awful. He followed his dog's hesitant lead until they reached a spot where the earth was disturbed beneath a mess of tree roots. The patch of ground looked out of place, as if it had been clawed open by someone desperate or hastily covered up. It was then that the smell reached him, a mixture of sharp, sweet, and rotten scents. He stood perfectly still. This was not the body of a dead deer. "It's okay, boy," Brandon whispered, although his own voice was shaking. He got on his knees and started to clear away the soil. His rough fingers made contact with something solid that was too white to be a rock and too curved to be wood. It was bone. The quietness of the forest seemed to grow, and it felt as though the trees were watching him. Initially, Brandon thought he had found an old gravesite, perhaps from 100 years ago. However, as more dirt fell away from the object, he gasped. Stuck deep inside a vertebra was a rusty piece of metal. He pulled on it gently, and in a ray of sunlight breaking through the trees, he saw the truth. It was an arrowhead, not a modern one used by hunters today, but an old, forged iron one that was rusting. Its edges were still sharp, and its tip was still stuck where it had once pierced a person. Brandon fell back on his heels, his heart racing. This was not an old artifact he had found by chance. This was an injury preserved through time. Someone had been attacked here, their spine broken by a deadly weapon. The realization felt heavier than any gun he had ever carried. It seemed to push him toward the ground, forcing him to accept what he had discovered. This wasn't just a bone. It was evidence of a violent act. Duke whined once more, scratching at the soil before jumping back as if the ground itself was rejecting him. Brandon knew how he felt. He had entered a part of the forest that held the memory of bloodshed. Before this day, the town had spoken of disappearances as accidents, of girls who had wandered too deep into the woods and lost their way. It was considered a tragedy, but one that still allowed for the idea of innocence and simple misfortune. Now that innocence was shattered. The arrowhead in the spine changed the entire story. This was not an accident, it was a murder. Brandon got to his feet unsteadily, still holding the bone. He pictured the missing girls, their young, smiling faces from old flyers, out here in the vast green forest, believing they were safe. He imagined the sudden, sharp sound of the arrow hitting its mark, the way a person would fall, their scream cut short. He thought about the silence that came after. The forest had held this secret for 5 years. Now it was revealing it to him, and he couldn't ignore it. He tied Duke to a nearby tree and with trembling hands began to dig more. With every handful of dirt, more bone fragments appeared, broken ribs and a piece of a skull, all worn by time but clearly human. He couldn't find a complete skeleton, only scattered pieces. It was possible that animals had taken parts of the body, or maybe someone had tried to hide the evidence. But the arrowhead, lodged firmly in the bone, was an undeniable message. It was a hunter's kill, a murderer's signature. The news of Brandon's discovery spread like wildfire, from the ranger station to the sheriff's office, and then from the sheriff to the whole community, which had almost forgotten about the missing girls. The story that had become a local legend, about the abandoned campsite and the hikers who disappeared, now returned as something much more sinister. Neighbors who used to say the girls must have simply gotten lost now started locking their doors earlier at night. Parents held their children tighter, and Kate Blackwell, who had held onto the small hope that her daughter Emma might still be alive, felt her world fall apart. This was no longer a spooky story. It was a murder investigation. What came next was not a sense of relief from having answers, but instead anger, suspicion, and the painful reopening of old wounds. How could such a violent act have stayed a secret for so long? Who had used that weapon? And why did the forest keep its secret hidden until now? The sheriff's deputies bickered about who had authority over the case. The state police were determined to bring in their own forensic experts. Old-time hunters noted that the arrowhead seemed too primitive for current times, which raised more disturbing questions. Was it a collector's item, an old weapon used for a cruel act, or was it connected to the region's own violent past? In the meantime, conspiracy theories started to spread through the town. Some people suggested the girls had accidentally found drug dealers. Others spoke quietly about survivalist groups, lone mountain dwellers, or even strange rituals. Every new theory added to the growing fear that the forest was not just a wild place, but a dangerous predator. For Kate, this new information was almost too much to handle. She thought back on all the nights she couldn't sleep, all the phone calls that went unanswered, and every memory of her daughter's laugh. Now, a dark shadow hung over every one of those memories. She now knew that Emma hadn't just been lost to the wilderness. Someone had deliberately ended her life. Hope was replaced by a burning rage. She insisted that the sheriff investigate the case as a homicide. She pleaded with the news media to report on it again and bring her daughter's name back into the public eye. "Don't let them be forgotten," she begged, her voice breaking but filled with fury. K.H. Lowe's family also came together, but their grief created a divide. Some wanted justice desperately, while others withdrew into themselves. As the investigation went on, more questions arose. The arrowhead was sent to a laboratory where experts on metal argued about how old it was. Was it centuries old, a remnant from the days of frontier battles? Or had someone made it to look old on purpose, as a way to mislead the investigators? The bones also had a story to tell. The vertebra was shattered where the arrow had struck. The victim would not have survived. Although the remains had not yet been identified through DNA, it was clear the person had died instantly. And if one of the girls was killed, what happened to the other one? The situation became even more horrifying. One girl had been murdered and the other might have seen it happen. Did she manage to escape? Was she also killed? Or was her fate even more terrible? It was a mystery that had lasted for years. By the time law enforcement secured the area, the forest was filled with the sound of sirens and the presence of search parties. But the more they searched, the more they found a lack of answers rather than solutions. The remains were too spread out, the clues were too old, and the silence was too intentional. The arrowhead was clear proof of a murder, but it was also a major question mark made of rust and bone. Who had shot the arrow? Why did it happen here, in the quiet woods of Colorado's backcountry? And what other secrets were hidden in the ground that was so unwilling to reveal its dead? The discovery didn't bring the case to a close. Instead, it tore it wide open. As the sun went down over the ridges, Brandon Mills sat on his porch with Duke beside him, the dog's anxious whine still echoing in his mind. He had brought a terrible truth out of the ground, but in doing so, he had unleashed something much more sinister. The forest was no longer silent. It was now filled with accusation. For several weeks, the investigation seemed to be going nowhere, with every potential lead fizzling out. Then, a new possibility came up, one that seemed almost too straightforward. The detectives began to focus on a group of rough-looking men who identified as survivalists. They were known in the Colorado wilderness for their deep distrust of the government, their camouflaged camps, and their practice of trying out homemade weapons in the woods. It wasn't hard for the police to see a possible link. The arrowhead found in the bone was very similar to the crude, iron-tipped arrows that these men were known to make in their workshops. More importantly, the survivalists already had a record. A few years before, some of them had been arrested for bringing unregistered bows, spears, and knives onto federal property. Old newspaper articles portrayed them as extremists who lived between the wilderness and a world of conspiracy theories. The community, desperate for a resolution, quickly accepted this idea. People began to whisper in cafes and church halls that the girls must have accidentally found one of the group's secret camps and were killed for trespassing. All the signs seemed to point in one direction: the type of weapon, the group's reputation, and the timing of the disappearance. However, despite the apparent certainty, something felt off about it. The explanation seemed too simple, like a lid being forced onto a pot that was still bubbling over. The police acted swiftly, organizing a raid on one of the survivalist compounds located deep in the forest. At sunrise, the quiet of the woods was broken by the sound of helicopters and the heavy steps of police boots. Officers in tactical gear spread out, yelling commands with their rifles aimed at the men who came out of their simple cabins with their hands in the air. Inside the cabins, investigators took note of everything they found. There were handmade crossbows resting against the walls, boxes of arrowheads made from scrap metal, barrels of dried meat, and piles of worn-out survival books. Pictures taken at the scene created an image of a dangerous group, which was enough to make the public believe the case was finally solved. Among the items they confiscated were arrowheads that looked remarkably like the one taken from the bone. They had the same rusty edges, hand-filed marks, and primitive style. For the sheriff's office, this felt like a major breakthrough that would lead to closing the case. News stations ran headlines in bold letters: "Local survivalists connected to mysterious death." Interviews with neighbors added fuel to the fire, with some calling the men dangerous loners and others sharing stories of unsettling encounters on remote trails. For Kate, Emma's mother, the news brought a mixture of fear and a strange sense of comfort. She thought that at least someone was being held responsible, and that justice for her daughter might finally be possible. But this feeling of victory did not last long. The man believed to be the leader of the group, a thin man in his 50s named Gregory Caldwell, did not back down from the accusations. While in handcuffs in the interrogation room, his sun-beaten face showed no signs of fear or guilt, only a cold and defiant attitude. "You think you have me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you're wrong." When questioned about the arrow, Caldwell gave a response that created serious doubts about the case. He stated that the arrowhead in evidence did not belong to them, or at least, not anymore. He explained that every weapon with that specific design had been taken from them years ago, in 2010, during a previous arrest. He claimed that the sheriff's office itself had taken possession of dozens of them. "If that arrow is in a body," he said, leaning forward with an unnerving calmness, "then it came from your own evidence room, not from me." The investigators were stunned. If Caldwell was being truthful, then the arrowhead that seemed to be their key piece of evidence might not lead to the survivalists after all. Even worse, it could mean that the weapon had been taken from police custody by an unknown person. The seemingly clear solution to the case started to fall apart before it was even fully formed. This new information sent the entire investigation back into a state of confusion. Reporters who had confidently pointed to the survivalists now had to correct their stories. The angry townspeople wanted to know if the sheriff's office had really lost track of such dangerous weapons. For Kate, the emotional roller coaster was unbearable. One minute she was imagining the killers caught and imprisoned. The next, she was lost in another void of uncertainty. If the arrowhead wasn't proof, then what was? And if the survivalists were not the ones responsible, then who was still out there in the forest, capable of such a violent act? Detectives looked through old files, trying to find evidence logs from 2010. But some of the records were gone, others were in poor condition, and none of them showed a clear record of the weapons. A disturbing possibility began to surface. Someone might have stolen the arrowheads years ago and kept the theft a secret until now. That person could still be free, watching and waiting. The case, which seemed to be heading toward a conclusion, had suddenly been thrown back into a darker and more complex mystery. It was a false resolution, a door that appeared to close only to reveal a more sinister one opening behind it. The audience is left in suspense, with their hearts pounding as they realize that what seemed to be the truth was just an illusion. The survivalists, who were once seen as the clear villains, might be guilty of many things, but perhaps not of this murder. Caldwell's defiance, instead of proving his innocence, raised an even more frightening question. If it wasn't them, then who was it? The story pauses at this critical midpoint, leaving a heavy sense of unease and hinting that the deepest secrets are yet to be uncovered. Just when it seemed the nightmare had found its monster, the plot took a sudden turn, clearly telling us, wait, this is far from over. The air in the police archive room was heavy with silence and the smell of old dust. It was the kind of quiet that settles over long-forgotten documents. When Detective Donovan called for a review of the evidence storage, nobody expected anything significant to happen. It was meant to be a simple, routine check. But as a clerk's flashlight beam moved across the shelf holding evidence from the 2010 survivalist raid, the peaceful silence became threatening. The box that should have contained arrowheads, labeled as Exhibit C, was empty. The only thing left inside was a yellowed sign-out card. Initially, it seemed like nothing to worry about, since official property was often checked out for research projects or training exercises. However, the date written in blue ink was shocking enough to make Donovan hold his breath. It was dated only 3 weeks before Emma Clark and K.H. Lowe Hayes went missing. This new information was as shocking as a bolt of lightning. The arrow that had been found in the recovered spine was previously written off as an old, unimportant item that was probably destroyed or lost in storage. But now, the record of who handled it revealed a frightening possibility. The weapon hadn't been sitting on a shelf collecting dust. Someone had checked it out, held it, and was capable of using it again. Evidence that seemed to belong to the past had suddenly sprung back to life, affecting the present case. Even more alarming, the sign-out sheet bore a name that nobody expected to see. The signature was neat and formal, with every letter formed with the precision of someone accustomed to signing official documents. In the column for the releasing officer was the name Nicholas Everett, a veteran park ranger, a man trusted to guard the same wilderness where the girls had disappeared. For a long time, Everett had presented himself as a source of comfort to the public. He had given interviews advising hikers to be careful in the forest but not to live in fear. He had stood by Kate Blackwell, Emma's heartbroken mother, during candlelight vigils, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It appeared that he had shared in their sorrow and cried with them. But now, his signature on the log turned all those memories into lies. Donovan could feel his own pulse racing as he stared at the ink. This was no longer an abstract conspiracy theory. The physical evidence created a direct link to a man who was still wearing his uniform and walking free. This was a man who had the keys to the forest and possessed both the opportunity and a reason to commit the crime. The realization was horrifying. Every comforting word Everett had spoken might have been a disguise. He had taken the very arrow that was later discovered inside a human bone, and there was no record of it ever being returned. The audit, which was supposed to be a simple administrative task, had uncovered a bombshell. Donovan understood that a signature could be explained away and motives could be misinterpreted. He needed solid proof. The critical piece of evidence arrived as a grainy security video from a roadside station located near the entrance to the trail. The video was dated July 17, 2015, the day before the girls went missing. In the footage, two young women, Emma and Chloe, were seen laughing and adjusting their backpacks, looking bright and full of life. Their smiles were visible even on the low-quality video. However, standing in the corner of the video, partially hidden by the building's shadow, was a man dressed in a ranger's khaki uniform. He was not talking to them or giving them any advice or warnings. He was just standing there, watching. His arms were crossed, his posture was rigid, and his eyes were locked on the girls with a chilling, predatory focus. Although the brim of his hat hid some of his face, his identity became clear when he turned his head. The security footage proved he was there, not on duty miles away as he had claimed, but just steps from Emma and K.H. Lowe, observing them hours before they vanished into the forest forever. The combination of evidence was overwhelming. The audit showed that the arrowhead was taken out under his name. The signature confirmed his link to the weapon. The security camera caught him following the girls with a quiet, menacing focus. What people once thought were just scary stories about a haunted forest now became a horrifying reality. The real danger had never been the wilderness itself. The threat had a badge, a position of power, and had offered fake sympathy to the grieving families. This discovery was a shock to everyone. Kate Blackwell broke down crying when she was shown the picture of Everett watching her daughter. Detectives who had previously shaken his hand were now filled with anger over his deception. Even the most experienced officers felt sick to their stomachs. If a person meant to protect others could be the attacker, then all the trust they had was built on a lie. This wasn't just the turning point of the investigation. It was the moment an entire illusion shattered. The twist didn't just solve the case, it completely changed its meaning. The arrow in the spine, which was once considered an old artifact from a paranoid survivalist group, was now understood to be a modern-day murder weapon. The nameless monster of the woods now had a name and a face. Everett had cleverly involved himself in every part of the tragic event. He had helped manage the search party, offered advice to Kate, and even made statements at press conferences. It was now obvious that the man who pretended to guide them through their pain may have been the one who inflicted it. For Kate, this truth was like a knife twisting in an old wound. "He hugged me," she said in a whisper, her voice trembling with the pain of his betrayal. "He promised me they would be found." The idea that she had taken comfort from the person who might have witnessed her daughter's last moments made her shake uncontrollably. For the local community, the information was explosive. People had previously blamed shadowy groups or isolated individuals for the crime, but never the friendly ranger in green. The mountains were already a place of danger, but knowing that the danger could be walking right next to you in a uniform was a terrifying thought. For Donovan, uncovering the truth was both a success and a burden. He had solved the case, but the discovery brought him no happiness. It was a story of horror, careful planning, and deep betrayal. Every image from the security footage was a stark reminder that the case was far from over. The arrow was not the final chapter, it was just the start. As all the evidence, the signature, the log sheet, the video footage, and the still photos, was displayed on the investigation board at the station, the full weight of the new reality sank in. The story was no longer about a mystery, it was about betrayal. It was no longer a question of what happened to the girls, but rather a demand to know what Nicholas Everett's involvement was and what he might do to keep the truth hidden. The climax was not just surprising, it was profoundly devastating. A trusted ranger, a missing weapon, and 2 lives gone. Everything pointed to one horrifying answer. The predator had never been hiding in the dark parts of the forest. He had been standing right in front of everyone, using the authority of his badge as a shield. The investigation was no longer about finding ghosts. It had turned into a hunt for a man. The raid on Nicholas Everett's secluded property was intended to be the final confirmation of their suspicions. However, no one could have braced themselves for what the officers discovered beneath the cabin's floor. The house itself seemed ordinary at first glance, with weathered wooden walls, shelves filled with hunting equipment, and family photos suggesting a normal life. But the search team found a hidden trap door under an old rug in the living room. The hinges, though rusty, were well-oiled and worked smoothly. As they lifted the door, a strong, musty smell mixed with the scent of iron rose from below. A staircase led down into complete darkness. The beams of their flashlights first hit narrow concrete walls and then revealed the outline of a secret cellar. This room was clearly not a simple shelter for storms. It was a cage. Inside, the officers found shackles bolted to the floor, stained padding that looked like it had been used as a bed, and chains hanging from the wall. A metal bucket in the corner confirmed that the cellar was used for holding someone for an extended period, not just for storing items. The most disturbing discovery was the faint scratch marks on the wall, some of which looked like unfinished words, the desperate final messages of a prisoner. The officers stood frozen, understanding that this was not just proof of a crime, but a silent story from someone who had been held captive for years. Forensic experts were called to the scene right away. They carefully collected every stain, piece of hair, and fingerprint that had been preserved in the damp environment. The lab results provided a horribly clear picture. Blood found on the concrete was a match for Emma Clark. DNA from the bedding also belonged to her. The evidence confirmed without a doubt that Emma had been kept alive in that cellar, trapped right under the home of a man whose neighbors never suspected a thing. The timeline put together by the forensic team revealed a story that was almost too painful to imagine. Emma had been alive for a long time after her friend K.H. Lowe had died in the forest. For 4 whole years, while her family was out searching, grieving, and holding on to any shred of hope, she was being held in chains. Her entire world had become a dark, hidden space beneath a ranger's house. Every season that went by, every holiday she missed, was just another reminder of the years that had been taken from her. When her bones were eventually found in a shallow grave just a short distance from the cabin, investigators knew the whole truth. Emma had managed to survive the wilderness only to die as a prisoner, denied her freedom and basic human respect. The autopsy report on her bones showed signs of long-term starvation and injuries from stress, indicating she had been deprived of sunlight, movement, and kindness. The report was written in a detached, scientific way, but every word painted a picture of a young woman whose life had been stolen. The most shocking part of the betrayal was not just that Everett had committed these terrible acts, but that he did it while using his position of authority as a cover. As a ranger, he was given the responsibility of protecting the wilderness and the people who visited it. He wore a uniform that was a symbol of safety and carried a badge that families trusted when their loved ones went missing. That uniform was his disguise. The investigation showed that he had taken advantage of his job to stalk hikers, keep an eye on campsites, and interfere with search parties. Security footage revealed that he had been watching Emma and K.H. Lowe before they disappeared, a cold and calculated act hidden by his role as a guardian. The arrow that had first connected him to the crime, which was once thought to be a simple coincidence, now served as proof of a predator who used the tools of a ranger for his own twisted obsession. The courtroom was full on the day the charges were officially read: unlawful imprisonment, several counts of severe assault, and the final charge of murder. The families of other missing hikers were there, sitting with Emma's grieving mother, Kate. Every person's face showed a mix of anger and relief, a storm of emotions as the legal process moved forward. The prosecutors laid out their case with cold, hard facts. They presented the forensic timeline, the scratch marks on the cellar wall, and the discovered remains. They demonstrated how Everett had checked evidence out of storage and altered records to hide his actions. With each piece of evidence, the image of the trustworthy ranger was torn down. When the jury announced the guilty verdict, the silence in the courtroom was broken by gasps and quiet sobs. The predator who wore a uniform had finally been exposed. For Kate, the verdict wasn't a victory. It was just the confirmation of the nightmare she had always feared. Her daughter had been alive, close by, and suffering while everyone thought she was gone. The end of the case did not heal the years of pain. For the community, it was a moment of harsh realization that evil can hide in plain sight, even in the most respected positions. For the police, it was a painful lesson about the consequences of overlooked clues and the need to re-examine evidence, no matter how old it seems. For Kate, the results were intensely personal. She finally had the truth, but it came with the terrible knowledge of how much Emma had suffered. After the trial, she faced reporters, her voice shaky but firm, and said, "My daughter's life was taken from her, bit by bit, every single day in a room under that man's house. I want people to remember her not as a victim, but as a fighter who scratched her name in the dark so we would one day find her." Her words resonated far beyond the courthouse. They became a permanent part of the case's story, a reminder to stay watchful and compassionate. Emma's name was included in memorials and vigils, and her story was shared not just as a tragedy but as a cautionary tale. Although legal justice was served, real peace was hard to find. Families of missing people rarely get simple, happy endings. The fact that Emma had suffered for years so close to where people were searching for her was a heavy burden for everyone involved. The emotional scars remained with Kate through her sleepless nights, with the community in their shattered trust, and in the haunting thought of how many others might have been missed. And yet, there was also strength. The discovery of Everett's crimes led to new rules for overseeing rangers, handling evidence, and policing wilderness areas. Communities came together to demand more accountability, and groups that helped find missing people found new motivation in Emma's story. In the end, this dark chapter was both a final word and a new start. It answered the question of what happened, but it also left behind lessons written in sorrow. The cellar was sealed, the chains were taken away, and the predator was locked up. But the memory of Emma Clark, her strength, her stolen years, and her mother's tireless search remained. It was the unavoidable consequence of learning the truth, painful, essential, and impossible to forget. The courtroom was completely still as Nicholas Everett's sentence was announced. In 2019, following months of witness statements, scientific proof, and heart-wrenching stories, the former ranger was found guilty. It took the jury only a short time to come back with the verdict everyone expected: guilty on all charges. The judge's final words were heavy with authority: life in prison with no chance of ever being released. For many years, Everett had used his uniform as a shield, mixing his power with a hidden darkness. The trial brought the horrifying truth to light. A person assigned to protect the wilderness had instead used it as his personal hunting ground. The sentence was not just a punishment for his crimes. It was a clear statement that his respectable image could no longer protect him. However, no prison sentence could heal the wounds inflicted on the families. Kate Clark sat in the courtroom, her hands shaking as she held a worn photo of Emma. Justice had been served, but it felt empty. For her, the verdict didn't bring back the lost years or stop the endless nights she had spent hoping her daughter was still alive. Every parent in the room shared her pain. The case that started as a mystery in the Colorado wilderness ended as a stark lesson about how fragile trust can be. Even with Everett in prison, Kate's grief was a constant presence. She said what many were thinking: justice isn't healing. It's just an acknowledgement of what happened. The story of Emma Clark and K.H. Hayes is more than just a tragedy. It is a serious warning. Evil can be hidden behind a friendly face, a badge, or a uniform. Trusting blindly can turn into a weapon against you. This story is a call for all of us to stay alert, not to be paranoid, but to be aware. Our communities depend on trust, but they become stronger with accountability. Asking questions, looking into things that don't add up, and paying attention when a situation feels wrong can be the difference between safety and tragedy. The darkness Everett concealed shows that danger is often right in front of us. It forces us to find a balance between having faith in people and taking responsibility for protecting ourselves and the ones we care about. As this story concludes, one question lingers. How well do we truly know the people in whom we place our trust? If this account affected you, please share your reflections. Do you think you would have noticed the warning signs? Do you feel that justice was fully served? Your opinion, your awareness, and your watchfulness could be what saves another family from a similar heartbreak. Feel free to comment below. Share this story to remind others to be careful. And always pay attention to red flags before they turn into regrets.